1 million chickens released into the open fields of Burkina Faso. To some, it sounded like madness. To others, it was a gamble too costly for a fragile nation to risk. Yet on that day when crates opened and wings beat against the Sahel winds, something larger than chickens was set free. An idea that Africa would fight its battles on its own terms. The skeptics called it waste. The world called it strange. But President Ibrahim Traoré stood firm, declaring, "This is not chaos. This is strategy." Some people watch and move on, but some stay because they know Africa deserves truth, freedom, and dignity. This channel is not for everyone. It is for those who believe in that. And if you are here, it means you have chosen to stand on the side of history. Stay with us. What you are about to hear is not just news. It is Africa rewriting its own destiny. Subscribe and stand firm, because history is happening right now. What began as a spectacle of feathers would soon unravel into one of the most controversial and astonishing experiments of our century. And the real story is only just beginning. Before the chickens came, there was devastation. Across Burkina Faso's dry plains, farmers walked their fields in silence, staring at stalks stripped bare by swarms of desert locusts and caterpillars. These pests, dark clouds against the sun, devoured entire harvests of sorghum, millet, and maize in a single day. What had taken months of labor vanished in hours. Men stood helpless, women wept, and children went to bed hungry. International aid organizations promised assistance, but their solutions were slow, entangled in bureaucracy. And even when help arrived, it came in the form of expensive pesticides imported from Europe, chemicals that scorched the soil and left villages dependent on foreign suppliers. It was a medicine more poisonous than the disease itself. It was in this bleak landscape that Ibrahim Traoré, the young soldier turned president, spoke a sentence that many found laughable. "We will fight plagues with chickens." Journalists were scoffed. Advisors hesitated. Villagers whispered. But Traoré had seen enough of dependency. He wanted something African, natural, and sustainable. And so began the plan to unleash Burkina Faso chickens into the wild. Why chickens? Because each bird is a tireless predator. A single chicken can consume hundreds of insects a day. Multiply that appetite by 1 million, and you have a living army against locusts that had terrified Africa for centuries. Yet Traoré's plan was more than pest control. Every chicken is a soldier, he told Parliament, but also a provider. Once the insects dwindled, the birds would breed, lay eggs, and provide families with protein for years to come. It was both shield and harvest, war and hope. The cost, however, was immense. Procuring, breeding, and distributing 1 million chickens strained the national budget. Logistics officers coordinated drop points across provinces, ensuring birds were spread wide enough to cover the fields. Critics called it wasteful. Western commentators mocked it as theatrics. But Traoré framed it differently. What is costly is hunger. What is costly is dependence. Chickens are an investment, not an expense. On the morning of the release, lorries rolled into villages. Crates were unloaded into open fields. Children laughed as chickens flapped into the grasslands. Farmers, weary from seasons of ruin, stood with cautious hope. Cameras from foreign news agencies zoomed in, capturing the sight of a landlocked nation unleashing its feathered battalion. To outsiders, it looked absurd. To Burkina Faso villagers, it felt like a prayer answered. But this was more than spectacle. It was strategy wrapped in symbolism. Traoré knew that images speak louder than reports. He understood that the sight of chickens flooding the fields would ignite debate across Africa, that it would brand him as a leader willing to gamble everything for sovereignty. And within days, the gamble began to show promise. In zones where the chickens roamed, locust swarms broke apart, their advance consumed before reaching the crops. Farmers who had prepared for another year of despair now whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, this mad idea could work. A farmer from Kaya told a local radio station, "Last year I lost everything. This year I still have grain in my hand. Maybe our chickens are wiser than chemicals?" He was not alone. Reports trickled in. Fields saved, insects reduced, eggs appearing in markets. But then comes the larger question, one that reached beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Was this simply an experiment or the beginning of a new African model? Do you believe Africa should decide its own future? Tell us in the comments, because what happens next may change how the world looks at sovereignty. Because this story, my brothers and sisters, does not end with chickens in the fields. In truth, it was only the first shot in a battle that would shake both the West and Africa itself. And the reactions, oh, the reactions, would be louder than the beating wings of 1 million birds. At first, the world laughed. Foreign newspapers splashed mocking headlines, "Burkina Faso goes to the birds." Western commentators spoke with ridicule, calling it a circus in a poor nation that cannot afford games. Political analysts predicted collapse. And even within Burkina Faso, opposition voices whispered that Ibrahim Traoré had gambled his presidency on poultry theatrics. But ridicule is a fragile weapon. Traoré understood this better than anyone. When asked about the mockery, he smiled and replied, "Yes, chickens may seem foolish, but sometimes the foolish win." That disarming answer shifted the tone. What began as ridicule soon turned into curiosity. Meanwhile, something was happening in the villages, something no commentator in Paris or Washington had predicted. Fields that once turned to dust after a locust swarm now stood green. Farmers walked their land and found fewer insects. Children carried baskets of eggs to markets that had not seen such abundance in years. For the first time, protein became affordable, even for the poorest households. A mother in Ouagadougou told a local station, "For the first time in 3 years, my children eat eggs every morning." And the numbers backed her claim. Surveys showed egg prices falling by nearly 30% in key markets. Malnutrition among rural children dropped measurably within months. What once sounded like fantasy was becoming data-driven reality. But why did this project frighten the West so much? Because it was not merely about food, it was about sovereignty. Every chicken scratching the soil was a living reminder that Africa could fight its own battles without chemicals shipped from Europe. Every egg cracked in a Burkina Faso kitchen was one less dependency on imported grain. And in politics, symbols are power. Traoré had turned ridicule into a spectacle of defiance. He was no longer the young captain mocked for being reckless. He was now a leader who dared to make his nation laugh at the mockers. It is worth remembering that great nations have always built symbols out of bold risks. America once poured resources into the Hoover Dam, not only to generate power, but to prove to its people and the world that it could master its destiny through sheer will. In the same way, Burkina Faso's chickens became a monument, not of concrete and steel, but of feathers and courage. The impact rippled far beyond the villages. African neighbors began to pay attention. Mali sent observers. Niger dispatched agricultural scientists. Even Kenya, thousands of miles away, quietly monitored the results. They wanted to know, could this audacious idea be replicated across the Sahel? Traoré leaned into the momentum. He gave speeches that resonated with ordinary Africans. What is costly is hunger. What is costly is dependence. Chickens are not a burden, they are freedom. These words echoed across radio waves, repeated in markets, retold in classrooms. For the rural poor, he was not just a president, he was a man who gambled for their survival. And so within weeks, the ridicule that had once filled foreign papers began to shift. Think tanks in Europe published cautious reports about novel biocontrol strategies. Universities sent students to study outcomes. What had begun as a joke was now the subject of academic debate. Do you believe Africa should decide its own future? Or must it always borrow from outside? Comment your truth, because your voice matters in this story. Yet even as curiosity replaced mockery, another transformation was unfolding. Farmers spoke of feeling seen for the first time. Women-led households, empowered by direct chicken distributions, gained new income streams. Poultry markets buzzed, and political opposition, once confident in their attacks, found themselves silenced by testimonies of farmers whose livelihoods had been saved. The chickens had become untouchable, and that was when the world began to realize this was no mere agricultural experiment. It was a political storm, a challenge to the very structure of global power. Because if 1 million chickens could rattle the world order, what would come next might shake it to its core. The release of 1 million chickens was never just about pest control. Its ripples soon reached deep into the fabric of Burkina Faso society. What began as a gamble in the fields quickly transformed into a revolution in daily life. In remote villages, women lined up to receive their share of the birds. By Traoré's decree, 30% of all chickens were allocated to women-led households. It was not only about fairness, it was strategy. Women became guardians of food security, their eggs filling baskets, their poultry feeding families. A widow in Ouagadougou said with pride, "For the first time, I sell something of my own at the market. These chickens are my strength." The numbers confirmed her story. Within the first year, local surveys showed poultry trading rising by 40%. Eggs, once a rare luxury, became a staple. Protein intake improved, particularly among children, where malnutrition rates in pilot regions dropped by almost 20%. In schools, eggs found their way into government-sponsored meals, giving students a nourishment that bread alone had never provided. But the impact was not only nutritional, it was political. Farmers who once felt forgotten by distant leaders now saw themselves in the president's gamble. No one has ever fought locusts with chickens, an elder declared on community radio. But if it is our chickens, it is our solution. His voice carried across the airwaves, and with it a sense of ownership spread. This language of ownership was Traore's true weapon. For decades, Burkina Faso politics had been plagued by disillusionment. Leaders in Ouagadougou were seen as distant, serving foreign donors more than their own people. But the chicken strategy was different. It placed the tools of survival directly in villagers' hands. That simple shift changed perceptions. Opposition parties tried to attack the plan, labeling it unsustainable. They argued that spending millions on poultry was irresponsible. But each time they spoke, they were drowned out by farmers who held up baskets of grains saved from locusts, or mothers whose children now ate eggs daily. To criticize the chickens was to criticize survival itself. Politically, the gamble became untouchable. But why did this matter so much? Because it altered the balance of power. Instead of dependency on imported pesticides, villages now invested in feed co-ops, local veterinary care, and small-scale poultry farms. Money that once flowed out to foreign suppliers stayed in Burkina Faso hands. Rural economies hummed with new life. Poultry traders prospered. Market stalls buzzed. And women, long excluded from political conversation, became vocal beneficiaries of the program, shifting the nation's political landscape. And the numbers continued to tell the story. Agricultural Ministry reports estimated that reduced crop losses saved nearly $70 million worth of grain in the first year alone. That was not theory. It was food in bowls, savings in pockets, and hope in the eyes of millions. Yet beneath the statistics lay a deeper change. For the first time in decades, people felt that their government was not begging for handouts, but building resilience with its own hands. Pride returned to conversations in tea stalls and village squares. "We do not wait for Europe," a farmer declared. "We fight for ourselves." Do you believe this is what Africa needed all along? If your heart says yes, then say amen in the comments, because this moment belongs not only to Burkina Faso, but to every African who dreams of sovereignty. Still, every gamble carries risk. Disease outbreaks occasionally struck poultry populations. Logistical challenges remained. Yet instead of undermining faith, these challenges created momentum for reform. Veterinary schools expanded training. New agricultural extension services reached remote villages. What seemed a gamble at first was slowly institutionalized into national policy. From the soil to the markets, from the household to parliament, the chickens had become more than food. They were instruments of politics, of pride, of power. They were a feathered army, not only against locusts, but against dependency itself. And their influence was not destined to stay confined within Burkina Faso's borders, because soon the crowing of these birds would echo far beyond the Sahel, reaching international halls where power itself would be forced to listen. The story of 1 million chickens could not remain a domestic tale for long. Within months, the eyes of the world turned toward Burkina Faso. What had once been dismissed as a rural stunt now demanded attention in diplomatic halls. At the African Union Summit, Ibrahim Traoré stood before delegates with a fiery declaration: "A nation that can defend itself against locusts with chickens can defend itself against poverty with courage." The hall erupted in applause. For many African leaders, this was not about poultry. It was about dignity. At last, here was an African solution to an African problem, free from the weight of foreign donors. ECOWAS neighbors such as Mali and Niger sent agricultural teams to study the model. Reports showed that in test zones, pest damage dropped by nearly 40% compared to areas without chickens. Such results were impossible to ignore. Quietly, delegations admitted, perhaps the future of pest management in the Sahel would not be written in laboratories in Paris, but in the villages of Ouagadougou. Meanwhile, BRICS nations seized opportunity. China offered to finance poultry feed plants. Brazil shared expertise in poultry genetics. India contributed vaccines. Russia assisted in grain storage. For them, the chicken experiment became a bridge for South-South cooperation, a chance to build multipolar alliances without Western oversight. And what of the West? European think tanks published warnings. Releasing 1 million chickens risks ecological imbalance, and they wrote. Media outlets doubled down on ridicule, branding Traoré the poultry president. Yet ridicule was no longer enough. To counter him, they needed facts. But facts betrayed them. Studies by African universities revealed the truth. Chickens, when managed properly, not only controlled pests, but enriched soil biodiversity. The ridicule began to look like fear. For Washington and Brussels, the fear was not ecological, it was political. If Burkina Faso could defend its crops with its own hands, then perhaps Africa did not need chemical imports, structural loans, or endless aid. Dependency itself was under attack, and that was a far greater threat than any locust swarm. Do you believe Africa can craft its own future without permission from the great powers? If you do, write it below, because every comment is part of a conversation the world cannot ignore. By now, the world was no longer laughing. Instead, they were watching carefully, nervously. Traore had not only changed agriculture, he had turned a feathered gamble into a weapon of narrative, defying the very structure of global power. And soon he would push that narrative further, toward a vision not just for Burkina Faso, but for all of Africa. From the beginning, Ibrahim Traoré insisted that the chickens were not the end of the story. They were the beginning. As the months turned into years, Burkina Faso began shaping what it called the Sahelian farm of the future. This vision was simple but radical. Crops and chickens working in a cycle of regeneration. Chickens ate the pests. Their manure enriched the soil. The soil nourished gave better harvests. And the cycle repeated. What outsiders mocked as chaos revealed itself as careful design. Farmers learned to integrate poultry into planting cycles, releasing birds after sowing, harvesting grain, then using chickens to fertilize the earth once again. Yields rose steadily. The land, once cursed by locusts, became a laboratory of resilience. But the chickens were more than biology, they were prophecy. They pointed toward an Africa that could stand on its own, inventing solutions from within. Just as America once used the Hoover Dam to mark its arrival as an industrial power, so too did Burkina Faso's chickens signal a new century of African creativity. Yet the road ahead is not without danger. Disease outbreaks among poultry remain a constant risk. International skeptics continue to warn of overpopulation or ecological disruption. And the challenge of scaling this model across diverse African climates remains daunting. But within risk lies opportunity. Every obstacle forces Africa to build institutions, veterinary schools, agricultural co-ops, local industries that strengthen sovereignty rather than weaken it. For ordinary Africans, the deeper question remains, will we embrace this moment as our turning point? Or will we allow ridicule and dependency to reclaim the story? The answer will not be decided in European capitals. It will be written in African villages, markets, and fields. Do you see Africa writing a new chapter for itself? Comment your vision below, because this is not only history, it is prophecy in the making. And so, the chickens that once drew laughter now draw attention from leaders across the continent. From Ethiopia to Nigeria, debates rage. Could this model defend their harvests, feed their children, and free them from foreign debt? Traore calls it sovereignty with wings. Others call it foolishness. But no one can ignore it anymore. Because beyond the feathers and the laughter, a greater truth is taking shape. The question is no longer whether chickens can save Burkina Faso. The question is whether Africa is ready to save itself. And the answer to that question will lead us to the most important part of this story, the legacy that will echo for generations to come. From ridicule to reverence, from skepticism to pride, the journey of Burkina Faso's chickens has become more than an agricultural experiment. It has become a living parable of sovereignty. Ibrahim Traoré, once dismissed as reckless, is now seen as the young captain who dared to gamble with a million wings and prove that even in one of Africa's poorest nations, courage can rewrite destiny. Today, the results speak louder than headlines. Pest damage has fallen dramatically. Malnutrition has declined. Rural markets hum with life. And most importantly, people feel ownership of their future. Every chicken scratching in the soil is no longer just an animal. It is a reminder that dignity is not gifted by outsiders, but built by those who refuse to bow. This is why the legacy of Ibrahim Traoré stretches far beyond Burkina Faso. He has given Africa a symbol, a reminder that boldness can silence mockery, and that sovereignty can grow even in the hardest soil. For years to come, scholars will debate the impact of this program. But ordinary Africans already know, when a leader trusts his people, miracles take flight. So when the world mocked the idea of Burkina Faso chickens, they failed to see what was really at stake. It was not about feathers, it was about freedom. And now, with fields greener and stomachs fuller, the people know the truth. Their future does not depend on imported chemicals or endless aid. Their future rests in their own hands. If this story stirred your spirit, don't let it fade. Share it, speak it, and let the world know Africa rises on its own terms. Subscribe, because silence is no longer our future. Gentlemen, thank you for giving your time and staying until the very end. You are not just viewers, you are witnesses to Africa's rise. What you've heard today is only a glimpse of the truth. In the next video, I will reveal what the world powers have tried to keep hidden. If you believe Africa deserves freedom and dignity, then stay with us. Because the truth that comes next may change the way you see the world.